The morning sunlight spilled across the old wooden porch, the same porch Margaret had swept for 40 years. She sat there, her frail hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, her eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the driveway. It wasn't just a home, it was the story of her life. Her daughter, Rachel, stood at the doorway, arms crossed, impatient. "Mom, you can't live here alone anymore. You fell last month. What if it happens again?" Margaret tried to smile. "I've been fine for 76 years, darling. I'll be fine a bit longer." But Rachel's eyes weren't kind. They were cold, practical, the kind that measured love by convenience. The truth was, Rachel had already made up her mind. The papers were signed, the arrangements made. Margaret would be moved to Brookfield Haven nursing home that afternoon. "It's for your own good," she said, her tone too rehearsed to be sincere. As the movers lifted the last of her boxes, Margaret's gaze fell on the small chest beside her bed, an old cedar box with a faded brass lock. Inside it were her letters, her memories, and one document no one knew existed, her will. She whispered to herself, "Let's see if kindness still counts for something, Rachel." When she stepped out of her home for the last time, the world felt quieter, not peaceful, just hollow. The taxi door shut. The house grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Rachel didn't look back. But Margaret did, and in her heart, she knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something Rachel would never forget. Brookfield Haven smelled of bleach and loneliness. The nurses were kind, but distant, their smiles painted on by routine. Margaret sat by the window most days, staring at the oak tree outside, its leaves falling slowly, like tiny goodbyes drifting to the earth. Her roommate, Edna, was a talker, a widow with a memory sharper than her tongue. "You're new here," Edna said one morning, knitting with trembling hands. "Don't let them make you feel forgotten. That's what they do when they think your family's moved on." Margaret smiled faintly. "My daughter says it's for my safety." Edna chuckled. "Honey, they all say that. What they really mean is, it's easier when you're not around to remind them what love used to look like." Days turned into weeks. Rachel called once, maybe twice. Her visits became rare. Excuses became common. "I've been busy, Mom. The kids had soccer. You understand, right?" Margaret never complained. She simply listened, her heart slowly stitching its own quiet kind of strength. Because while Rachel forgot her mother, Margaret was busy remembering everything. One chilly afternoon, she asked Nurse Lydia to bring her the small cedar box from her old home. "It's just some keepsakes," she said softly. But inside that box was the real story. A will she had written 2 years ago and updated secretly after her husband's death. In that will, she'd made a choice. Her estate wouldn't go to the daughter who abandoned her, but to someone who truly cared. That someone was Lydia, the nurse who treated her not like a burden, but like a human being. Margaret smiled as she sealed the envelope again. "Love doesn't need blood to be real," she whispered. The oak tree outside swayed gently, as if agreeing. What Margaret didn't know was that Rachel had her own plans, plans that would soon turn this quiet peace into a storm. It was a quiet Sunday morning at Brookfield Haven when Rachel finally decided to visit. She hadn't seen her mother in almost 6 months. Her guilt was faint, like an old bruise she pretended didn't ache. but her curiosity was alive, sharp and restless. "Mom," she began, her tone soft but calculated, "I've been talking to the lawyer. We need to finalize the sale of your house." Margaret looked up slowly, her eyes calm, almost too calm. "My house?" she asked. "Yes," Rachel continued. "It's for the best. The money can help with your care here." Margaret smiled faintly. "Rachel, you already sold it months ago." The words hit, like glass shattering, not loud, but cutting deep. Rachel's face froze. "What do you mean?" Margaret's voice never trembled. "You forget, dear. The bank calls me too." For a long pause, the air between them went still. Margaret leaned back, her frail hands folded. "Do you know what hurts more than losing a home? It's losing a daughter while she's still alive." Rachel stood up, defensive now. "Mom, I did it for you." But Margaret's eyes, gentle, wise, unshaken, met hers. "No, Rachel, you did it for yourself." 2 weeks later, Margaret passed away quietly in her sleep. No grand speeches, no final phone calls, just a letter left on her bedside table, addressed to Rachel. The letter read, "My dear daughter, you sent me away, but don't think I ever stopped loving you. I simply learned the difference between love and dependence. I have left everything to the person who reminded me what compassion feels like. Nurse Lydia." You see, Rachel, love when given freely becomes an inheritance no money can buy. When Rachel sat in the lawyer's office a week later, her world collapsed in silence. The will was read, every word felt heavier than the last. The house she sold was no longer hers to claim. The accounts she expected were gone. Everything, every last penny, was now Lydia's. For the first time, Rachel cried. Not because she lost her mother's wealth, but because she realized she had lost her mother's heart long before the will was written. Outside the nursing home, the oak tree stood tall, swaying gently in the wind. Somewhere in the whisper of its leaves, it felt like Margaret's voice saying, "Love always writes the final line." The days after the funeral felt endless for Rachel. She wandered through her mother's empty house, the one she once called a burden, now echoing with silence that felt heavier than grief. Every corner whispered her mother's presence. The rocking chair near the window, the old tea kettle still sitting on the stove, and the scent, lavender and old wood, it was everywhere. For the first time, Rachel didn't feel in control. She felt small. She opened the small cedar box Lydia had returned to her. Inside were the family photos she'd left behind, and a letter, written in shaky handwriting. "For my Rachel," it said. Rachel unfolded it with trembling hands. "I forgive you," the letter began, "not because you asked, but because anger would only keep me from peace. I hope one day you'll understand that love isn't about what we give. It's about what we keep alive in others." Tears blurred her vision. For the first time, she realized how far she had drifted. Not just from her mother, but from the person she used to be. She wasn't proud anymore. She was hollow. And no amount of money could fill that space. That night, Rachel drove to Brookfield Haven. She stood beneath the oak tree where her mother used to sit with Lydia. The air was cool, quiet, heavy with memory. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered. "I was wrong." The wind stirred softly, like a sigh of forgiveness.
A year passed. The seasons changed, and with them, so did Rachel. She sold her big house, the one she had once thought she needed, and began volunteering at Brookfield Haven every weekend. She met people who reminded her of her mother, quiet souls with kind eyes and forgotten stories. She brought them flowers, baked bread, and sat with them in silence, the way she wished she had done for Margaret. One afternoon, Nurse Lydia approached her, smiling softly. "Your mother would be proud," she said. Rachel nodded, her voice trembling. "I just wish I had listened sooner." In her mother's name, Rachel started a small foundation, the Margaret Carter Fund, helping elderly women without families find dignity and care. For her, it wasn't redemption. It was remembrance. Years later, under the same oak tree, a plaque was placed that read, "For those who taught us that love is the only legacy worth leaving." The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying the faintest whisper, "Love always writes the final line."